welcome everyone. And thank you very much for joining us today for this online panel session. This session is part of the One Basin CRC's series of addressing key topics in the Murray-Darling Basin Authority's Basin Plan Review discussion paper. And today's session is titled Scaling Water Banking in Aquifers. My name is Seth Westra. I'm the Research Director of the One Basin CRC, and it is a real pleasure to be with you today on this very important and I think maybe a little bit underexplored topic for the basin. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge country and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the Murray-Darling Basin and their nations, and also to any Indigenous people who are here with us today. I myself am joining you from Kaurna country in the Adelaide Plains, a little bit outside of the basin, and I'd like to also pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. The One Basin CRC is a collaboration across a broad partnership of industry, government, community and research organisations, and it exists to allow us to grow, to work together to grow value from water in a changing world. And these panel discussions are very much part of this purpose by essentially promoting dialogue, understanding a few different perspectives, and encouraging the free exchange of ideas. If you've participated in earlier panel sessions, you would have seen this next slide before with our different partners, and really showing the breadth of the different partners in the CRC, as I said, spanning industry, government, community and research. And if you are from any of these organisations, partner organisations, I'd like to extend a particular welcome to you. So, as I said, this topic is all about water banking. We'll start with the basics for those of you who haven't heard much about water banking or maybe get lost in some of the key terms and concepts that are used to describe this area. And then we'll go into some of the opportunities and challenges associated with adopting water banking solutions more widely across the basin. And finally, we'll really get into what it might mean for policy and the Basin Plan Review in particular. Before introducing our panellists, I would just like to briefly highlight that the CRC is investing in a research project on that very topic, on water banking, and it's an ongoing research project. It's still got a little way to go before it provides its final conclusions, but at least some of today's discussions will be informed by some of the ideas that are coming out of that project. And each of our panellists is actually associated with that project in different ways. So that provides a wonderful segue to our panellists. So I'd first like to introduce Simone Stewart from the South Australian Department of Environment and Water. Simone is a hydrogeologist and policy specialist with more than 20 years in the South Australia water sector. And Simone is also on the Project Advisory Committee of the Water Banking Research Project. Next, I'd like to introduce Andrew Ross, who's a research fellow at the Australian National University, working on water banking and integrated groundwater surface water management. Welcome, Andrew. And finally, Yvette Colton, an independent water policy advisor with over 15 years of experience working within and advising government on complex water reform. And both Yvette and Andrew are members of the project team for that water banking project I mentioned earlier. Okay, so to our discussion, I'll start by asking our panellists some pre-prepared questions, but there should be some time for Q&A at the end. So if any questions come up for you during this discussion, please pop them in the Q&A. There should be a little icon at the top of your screen, I think, that says Q&A. So please pop them there, and hopefully we'll get a bit of time towards the end of the session to address some of those questions. So let's get straight into it and start, as I said, with the basics. So this is a session about water banking, and I know that there's actually quite a number of different terms that are sort of thrown about, sometimes interchangeably and sometimes meaning subtly different things. For example, we commonly hear about water banking, managed aquifer recharge, and aquifer storage and recovery. So I might start with you, Yvette. Can you help us unpack these different concepts? What do we mean when we talk about water banking?
Yeah, sure. I think it's important context before we jump into our discussion. I think, to me, managed aquifer recharge and aquifer storage and recovery, or MAR, ASR, they're really the physical mechanisms of how you get the water into the aquifer and then out again. And it can it can be done through different methods like injection wells or infiltration basins, or even natural recharge pathways like wetlands, for example. And then what we mean by water banking is the system, like the accounting arrangements, the governance, the rules, the physical mechanism, as well as those physical mechanisms that allow the water to be stored and used later. Water banking is really about shifting water through time, because it allows us to store it when it's available and set it aside in the aquifer, and then we can use it when we need it later. And that's an increasingly important thing to be thinking about as we have more variability with climate change, with things like bigger floods and longer dry periods ahead of us. Just as a little bit more context, they can operate at different scales, from like a local user or council scale through to like a town water supply scheme we've seen in Perth, even to system scale approaches. And that's been proven internationally to work in the US at that bulk scale in states like Arizona and California. And they can use alternative sources of water, or they can operate within like the native water system and within the entitlement and accounting frameworks that we have.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks for that that overview. And you sort of talked about storage, because sometimes, there's the perception that water banking is about creating new water, but of course, we can't create new water. So maybe the question for Andrew is, where does the water for water banking actually come from?
Yeah, thanks, Seth. So, yeah, water banking, water resources, I should say, in the Murray-Darling are fully allocated. So the water for banking needs to come from other sources, mainly from existing water entitlements or purchased on water markets. And water can be purchased and stored in aquifers when the water is plentiful and prices are low, and then recovered for use when water is needed, for example, as a reserve during a drought, when water is scarce and prices are high. In New South Wales, there's a category of supplementary water licenses, which is special to that state. Supplementary water can be made available when flows exceed high security water needs and delivery requirements and can't be captured or re-regulated into storages. Near human settlements, recycled stormwater and wastewater can provide other sources for MAR, and that's happening increasingly around urban areas. For example, stormwater harvesting schemes in Adelaide and wastewater recycling in Perth. And another possible source is desalinated brackish water, trialled in South Australia under a CRC Quick Start project. I'd also like to say water needs to be fit for purpose for the recharge and the intended end use. So water treatment is normally required for any water sources to protect human health and to manage biological and chemical contaminants and to manage clogging of infiltration basins and also the drills that are used to inject and recover. And impacts on connected surface water and receiving aquifers also need to be managed. So managed aquifer recharge projects also usually need in fact, always need a risk assessment plan and usually need an environmental impact statement.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you very much, Andrew. Now, I think Yvette already sort of alluded to the idea that there are already managed aquifer recharge sort of schemes and water banking concepts that are happening, and so this is not really a new idea. Simone, I'm aware that in South Australia, that we've been quite active in this space. Could you make that a little bit more concrete? Could you sort of give some tangible examples of some successful water banking projects?
Yeah, so yes, we have been doing managed aquifer recharge, which is kind of the term we tend to use. So I'm going to slide into that instead of water banking probably a lot through this for decades. So I think late 70s, early 80s was our first scheme that was set up. So we're talking, 50 years there. 50 years, I'm just aging myself by 10 years, maybe 40 something. So at the Adelaide region, at the moment, we have 39 operational MAR schemes, and that's just in the Adelaide Metro region. So if we add in McLaren Vale there, we've also got another 3 schemes there. And then across the state, there's some other schemes as well, like Angus Bremer and things like that. So to give you an idea of the volumes of water that we've got banked just under the Adelaide region, we're talking about 21 gigalitres of banked water. So that's a lot of water that's been put into underground storage, which can be recovered and used when it's actually needed. In most of these cases, particularly for the Adelaide region, it's councils or SA Water or those kind of operators that are looking to use water, particularly for cooling and greening, so irrigating open space. There's a little bit of industrial use, and then when we talk about those schemes in McLaren Vale, that's also for irrigation of vineyards. So it can be very good use of water. Mostly sourced from stormwater, but we do have a few schemes that use recycled wastewater, which can be, rather than bumping that out to the ocean, actually pumping it back into the aquifer and using it to irrigate vines, a fantastic use of that water. So when we talk about what are the benefits, I think, Yvette and Andrew have already touched on some of these, but it reduces the demand on our native systems, which means we're using less native groundwater and surface water across the Adelaide region. It reduces our stormwater outflow to the sea, so we're getting less nutrients out to the sea, which is great. In many cases, it's improved our groundwater pressure. So the aquifers that we put the water in under the Adelaide region are tertiary confined aquifers, and they've had a lot of use from them over multiple decades. And we started to see water pressures drop in those aquifers. So by putting the managed aquifer recharge schemes in place, we're actually seeing some recovery of those back to natural artesian conditions. Not that that doesn't have its own impacts in some instances, but much better than them being severely depleted resources. We also see some improved water quality through mixing, because the quality of the water that you're injecting into the aquifer, based on our rules, has to be of better quality than that which is already in the aquifer. So we start to see a freshening of the aquifer as well, which means that it has these flow-on effects to other users of that water resource. And importantly, it reduces the demand on SA Water mains water, which comes from the River Murray, because rather than irrigating open space with, water that could be used for critical human needs, we're irrigating it with this managed aquifer recharge water that we do have in the system. And while we sort of talk about that, I will just flag one project we have underway at the moment, which is the Alternate Water Supplies Efficiency Measures Program. So this is funded under the Australian Resilient Rivers Water Infrastructure Program. And it's basically an opportunity to invest in infrastructure that substitutes River Murray water for the irrigation of open space for alternative water supplies such as stormwater and wastewater. So at the moment, we have 6 councils signed up to that project, and through expanding their existing MAR scheme, so that could be adding in additional wells, or it could be pumping, like putting in pipe work to pump their water to other areas so they can irrigate additional open space. We are saving 1.7 gigalitres of River Murray water at the moment, which is fantastic.
Thank you, Simone, and thanks to all 3 of you for setting the scene, so well. What I think I'm hearing is, that water banking or managed aquifer recharge, or whatever we call it, is a really diverse area with lots of different sort of scales of application, different types of benefits, case studies and so forth, which is really, really interesting. I'd like to maybe delve into the opportunity of water banking a little bit more deeply, and might throw back to you, Yvette. How would you describe the potential opportunity of water banking that exists before us now?
Thanks, Seth. Part of my role on the working group has been to develop a white paper which will be released in time, really trying to marry up the opportunity that water banking presents with needs in the basin that we have. And I think I'd start with saying that the research and evidence that this is it's not a speculative but credible tool is strong. And that water banking, there's been shown to be over 4,000 gigalitres of underground storage capacity in the basin, with favourable hydrological conditions as well. That's around the scale of Dartmouth Dam, available potentially to be storing and setting aside water when there's plenty for for when we need it most. And it's also been shown to be cost competitive. Of course, that's always a key consideration around incentives. But for example, we can use the aquifer rather than having to build expensive infrastructure for storing it in surface water. I think at the same time, though, it's important to sort of call out this is not a silver bullet solution. And we're not suggesting that it replaces the need for major dams or storages and other solutions. I think it's best put as a complementary option, which, as Andrew started talking on, is it needs to be carefully considered in the circumstances for the feasibility and risks of each project. But in terms of key opportunities, I think the two that strike me is that we can make better use of the water that we have by storing it when it's available and using it when it's most needed. We can that includes like using it for potential town water security or irrigation needs by demands that are sort of inflexible, like citrus, for example, or almonds. And it could even potentially be at that basin scale as well. So the major storages obviously have a capacity or a limit, but water could potentially be set aside into groundwater banks to prevent or manage spills. And we could have local water banks strategically located near where demand is, so that we can avoid the need for it to travel long distances and have it available at peak periods. The other key opportunity is around using water more efficiently and potentially reducing losses and improving our reliability over time. In the basin, many of the straightforward recovery measures to return to the SDLs have been exhausted, and the analysis through this work has been that less than 1% of basin funding has gone to groundwater and MAR investment. So there appears to be an underutilised opportunity there. At a basin scale, rather than having water sitting in large storages, there could be the potential to be setting it aside to achieve savings underground, but also to reduce losses of having to move water large distances, as I mentioned. And then sort of drawing on what Simone said, there are existing schemes like the ones in that Awesome program or by Oakland's Park City of Marion that are achieving SDL recovery through demand reduction. And as far as our investigation goes, South Australia is the key state taking up those opportunities. So it would be great to see that expanded into other states as well as we move into the next phase of the basin plan. Importantly, those schemes are not only achieving reducing pressure on systems and supporting local water security, but they're creating those environmental outcomes like improving the aquifer levels, but also like community and cultural outcomes too, having a place for people to be where there's amenity and community recreation, but also for local First Nations groups. That Oakland's Park example, there's a cultural centre that provides training and tours, and that then provides economic opportunities and opportunities to further caring for water and country outcomes. Just lastly, I think I've pointed to some big picture opportunities there, and I think I would like to qualify it by saying it needs to be practical. So like in terms of shorter term progress, I think the focus needs to be on building more awareness, testing what works, what doesn't through pilots, making sure funding's flowing to have those opportunities, and certainly addressing some of the policy and regulatory barriers that create a disincentive for investment at the moment. Thanks.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks, Yvette. And we'll be delving into some of those sort of potential barriers and opportunities around the basin plan sort of shortly. But maybe just dwelling on the storage, question a little bit more, and this is for you, Andrew. How could you imagine that water banking would allow us to really rethink the approach to storing water across the basin?
Yeah, well, of course, we store most of our water for town water use and irrigation in reservoirs on the surface. But nevertheless, groundwater storage is a very important source of water. Actually, globally, water stored in aquifers is the main source of fresh water on the planet, and it's the most predictable and reliable source. So we need to really think about bringing groundwater storage into the picture and also conserving it and making sure it's not depleted by high levels of extraction during droughts. And I'd mentioned that the MDBA has already provided evidence in the Basin Plan review documents of long-term declining groundwater levels in alluvial aquifers in the MDB. So water banking is a tool to build groundwater storage as part of an integrated water storage solution to increase drought resilience right across the basin. And the cost of evaporative loss from surface water storages is a powerful argument for reviewing national water storage, objectives and increasing aquifer storage, which incurs much lower and slower losses than reservoirs, and then using water banking to increase this drought resilience. So some numbers here. In 2019, the New South Wales government estimated that net evaporation loss from major storages in the New South Wales was 616 gigalitres, which is a lot of water in the context of the Basin Plan. And I did some rough back of the envelope calculation using water pricing in the MDB to work out that it translates into about 150 million in a normal year and 370 million in a dry year. And there have been bigger estimates of this produced before for the whole of the basin. Another component of this is the evaporative loss from floodplain storages and farm dams. So the evaporation loss from floodplain storage in the northern MDB has been estimated at 400 gigalitres a year, while evaporation from farm dams could be as high as 1,200 gigalitres. And I think it's great that to note that there's now a basin, a CRC project, I should say, doing a detailed investigation of reducing evaporative loss in the northern basin, and that includes a detailed analysis of evaporation from 1,000 farm dams. And it will be great to get those really good updated estimates of what what's being evaporated. So the development of groundwater storage, though, needs a strong policy platform. And historically, water storage has not really been considered in national water policy and legislation. And the new National Water Agreement could and should include an integrated national approach for water storage among its strategies. And the National Commission could supervise a stocktake of all water storages, accessibility and availability and a cost as the first step to build that, to build the information we need for that program. And the incentive for it needs to be built as well. So at the moment, surface water is delivered mainly at almost no cost to irrigation areas, with no charge for this evaporative loss. So this cost is kind of socialized. But if the irrigation districts want to set up an underground storage, they have to pay for it themselves. We'll discuss possible incentives for underground storage and some of the impediments later. Yeah, thanks, Seth.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Just continue with the benefits. I think, Simone, you already sort of talked about some of the benefits from those case studies, but I'm wondering if you can maybe elaborate a little bit. What do you sort of see as some of the main application areas for water banking?
Yeah, I mean, in short, it's improved water security. To expand on that a little bit, you know, as Yvette said, it's the opportunity to store water when we've got it available and use it when we actually need it. So it kind of smooths out the peaks and troughs of demand that we might see on either our native resources or our mains water supplies if people have access to MAR banked water that they can use. As Andrew said, you know, you don't get the same losses from banking the water in the ground as you do if you store it in dams, etc. So you've got the water that you have actually stored is still there when you go back to want to actually access it. So again, there you've got more improved water security. It helps to move water to its highest value use. So, you know, when we've got councils that are irrigating open space, which we know is really important for, you know, mental health and people being part of the community. And I mean, green space is just fantastic for greening and cooling cities like Adelaide. But if we're using River Murray water to do that, is that an effective use of that water? Where when we've got managed aquifer recharge water that we can tap into or banked water that we can use to irrigate those spaces, that means that we can put that River Murray water to where we think we need it in those times when it is a bit drier, and that is meeting those critical human water needs instead. And on keeping things green and cool, you know, during the Millennium Drought, we saw sort of massive dieback of trees and open spaces across the Adelaide region. And that was because the councils weren't able to irrigate these spaces the way they historically had because of water restrictions that were in place because we had such low water supplies. With managed aquifer recharge in place now and that being used as the source for where most of these councils irrigate their green space from, we haven't seen that same dieback as we've gone through recent dry periods in Adelaide more recently. So that's been great as well to be able to maintain those cool spaces, those green spaces for the community. The other thing it does is it also supports sort of long-term planning and investment. So if you know that you've got security in your water supply, you're more inclined to plan ahead for the future and sort of, you know, progress things the way you plan without thinking about, am I going to run out of water for what my needs are? So, you know, in the water allocation plan that covers the Adelaide region, we have some very specific rules around managed aquifer recharge. And it's basically what you bank, what you put into the aquifer, you get to recover. And we just kind of keep a bank balance of that to let you know what that volume is at any point in time. We do limit the volume you can recover at any one point in time, just because we want to make sure we don't see this massive decline in water levels if you take out, you know, 20 gig of water at once. But I mean, who's going to do that anyway? But that's always open to flexibility and availability if you can sort of prove up that taking a larger volume of that limit that we have set is appropriate and isn't going to cause any degradation to the resource or other people who are trying to use the resource. And so while our native resources in this region do have like an adaptive management approach where we have variable allocations based on sort of the resource condition, the managed aquifer recharge schemes have got full security. Basically, they know exactly how much water they can take from one year to the next. They know exactly how much they've got in their bank. So they can start expanding operations while potentially, you know, other licensees are considering, are we going to have to restrict what we're growing this year because we don't know what our water availability is going to be. And so I guess it just, it builds that resilience and underpins smarter long-term decision-making for those people in the regions.
Yeah, thanks for that answer. And I mean, we can sort of already sort of hear a lot of the different benefits, particularly sort of linked to things like water security. And I might bring Andrew you back in here, because you've also talked a lot about the idea that water banking has the potential to achieve a number of really positive environmental outcomes. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more on what some of those outcomes could be?
Yeah, so in principle, you can take water and bank it into, let's say, a riverine environment to provide more base flow to the river and provide to increase the health of the surrounding vegetation in the ecosystems, right? So that's the in principle argument. Actually, in the Murray-Darling at the moment, we don't have very many examples of this. The best ones I know are actually in Northern California, And it's really driven by the fact that surface water users have a priority over water. So anyone pumping groundwater has to make good any kind of losses to the stream. And so in those places, they've developed quite interesting water banking collaborations to ensure that water flows keep on being sustained. And also it's very good there for fish populations. For example, it supports salmon breeding runs and so on. Another example of an environmental benefit is the creating barriers around coastal areas for saltwater intrusion. What I mean is that salt water can leak into the coastal aquifers, so you can use a MAR project to create a wedge of fresh water to prevent the saltwater intrusion. And for that sort of project, there are really huge examples overseas. I might stop there, Seth. That's just really opened, only having had a very small opening discussion about all the potential. There are lots of different examples.
Yeah, and I'm sure each of these could be elaborated, quite extensively. There's a lot of different examples, as you said, around the world that we can draw on. Maybe just changing the direction of the questions a little bit. Yvette, I know you've been you've started the process, I guess, of engaging with First Nations peoples around water banking. Could you maybe give us a little bit of a window into what you're hearing, from these engagements? What are you hearing from a First Nations perspective about water banking?
Yes, I can. I do want to qualify that it has been really early engagement, and there is a genuine desire to continue to have those discussions. But in short, some of the key messages we've received are that there is strong interest in the opportunity that water banking presents, but we need to make sure that the risks are understood and managed, and that from the perspective I heard, that groundwater to those First Nations representatives wasn't seen as just a resource, but a living cultural system connected to the identity and law and country that those First Nations groups value so much. So any form of water banking needs to start from respecting and understanding what that means and what it means to protect that. I think one exciting opportunity we touched on was around the need to make sure that any projects and investment, whether at that local or wider scale, are being designed and governed in a way that genuinely respects and includes First Nations perspectives, and that that can then lead to really great outcomes. Like I mentioned, the Oaklands Park one before, that it's not only a site that's providing water supply, but also benefits for the community, for maintaining important species of plants, and for the First Nations community there to operate a cultural centre with training and the opportunity to share insights and learnings about those values. So that was a key takeaway around how important that is to be designing through that shared governance and approach.
Yeah, thanks, Yvette. And as you said, early days in terms of the conversation, but certainly highlights a lot of things that we need to think about carefully. If I can stay with you, Yvette, kind of feel like we've heard a lot of arguments for the benefits of water banking, but why are we not doing more of it in the basin? What do you think are the things that are holding us back at the moment?
I think, in short, the systems that we haven't necessarily been set up to support it. It was put well in some recent engagement we had that the state rules don't necessarily prohibit it, but they don't enable it either. And that means that it affects the certainty of investment for proponents, and it's a disincentive to consider that amongst other options. Obviously, also, we don't have accounting and water sharing arrangements to do water banking at that interjurisdictional scale either. So that's another question and area of reform needed. To me, there's 4 things that struck me as key barriers. The first is that it requires more integrated management and planning approaches and traditionally we've been managing surface water and groundwater quite separately. And that creates a complex accounting thing to be managed by water managers and risks around water resource management. But like in reality, it's a system of credits and debits that's needed to be able to track what's in, what comes out. So I have confidence that with a bit of we could leverage systems like trade accounting and other systems to be able to track that water. The second key thing is around lack of clearly defined rights. So the South Australia is more leading in this space, but generally, like there hasn't been very clear rights to store the water underground that's exclusive to that water user that put it in, and then it needs those rights to store it over time, and then the right to get it out again. And currently, that water might not be counted or protected, or it might expire, or it might go into the common pool of water that's then available to others. So that exclusivity is really important. The other thing is, third thing, economic barriers. There can be really lengthy, complex approvals needed, a need to invest without the certainty that it will be approved. There might be other cheaper options, and also that delay in the investment paying off can be a real disincentive. So we've seen it be more taken up by councils or utilities who can absorb that risk or cost more than like local level users. And then finally, the fourth thing is around the incentives for efficient storage. In the basin, we've had incentives for efficiency around use of water, like metering and putting a cost on use of water, but there hasn't been incentives around efficient storage, like it's sitting in dams as such. And that does create incentives around investing, more around surface water than groundwater, I think. I think that just lastly, there's a real need, Simone mentioned that most of the examples in South Australia are drawing on alternative sources like recycled or stormwater. There's a real need to show how it can work within existing entitlement systems to build confidence around expanding it in the basin. Thanks.
Thank you. And that segues quite nicely to my next question, I think, Simone. I mean, you've provided quite a few really great examples of South Australia doing this already, but I'm curious about some of the issues that might come up to scale this, regionally or cross-jurisdictional. Recognising, of course, the basin is quite a large multi-jurisdictional environment. I'm wondering if you can maybe elaborate on what some of those issues could be.
Yeah, so I mean, at a local level, obviously, it's managed by the state legislation and within our state framework. So we have spent, lots of time developing those frameworks, how to issue entitlements, how to manage the water that's going in, how to account for the water that's coming back out, all of those kind of things. But when we start to look at how we might do that cross-jurisdictionally, we need to consider how it would impact any of our cross-jurisdictional agreements and things like that as well. So I'm going to show my naivety here because I don't work in the river of all spaces, even though this is a basin plan session. So, I mean, I might get a few things wrong here, but, my general understanding of South Australia River Murray flows is that, there's some water in storages interstate, and that determines what our allocation is for the year or something to that effect. And so there's some question around, okay, well, if water banking was taken up more readily interstate and people in New South Wales were banking a lot of that water, that's obviously going to mean that there's a lot of less water in those reservoirs or in those storages that are helping determine what our allocations are for the coming year. And so how is that going to be incorporated into accounting measures? Like, in the long run, it's going to be good because it's going to be a saving. We're not going to be losing water from those reservoirs, but it is going to impact the calculations that will determine how much water is available to us. And so that kind of needs to be thought about in those sort of downstream impacts. And I guess flowing from that as well is the concern around, most of our environmental water that we get in South Australia is because of overflows or spills from those reservoirs. If they start to disappear because people are banking that water in the aquifer instead, what does that mean for South Australian ecology and systems that are reliant on those flows when they do actually occur? And so there's a lot of it is policy issues, obviously, like cross-jurisdictionally, we would need to change a lot of the agreements or, the federal legislation, et cetera, to enable water banking to occur at this cross-jurisdictional level. But it's also around that accounting. How are we going to redetermine how we account for all of this water in the River Murray if some of it is going to be banked and things like that? And things like it might be better off banking as a South Australian licensee or something. It might be more beneficial for me to bank water in New South Wales and then, have someone chuck it back in the river when I actually need to use it. How's that going to work from an accounting framework to make sure that it's not double accounted for as it's coming out of the river and going into the ground and coming back out of the ground and going back into the river, but coming across the border because it was from 3 years ago or something like that? So cross-jurisdictionally, it becomes, much more complex.
Yes, which is kind of a story of the Murray-Darling Basin, water management in general, that like the headline, of course, 4,000 gigalitres of available sort of opportunity is, sounds great, but once you start getting into the details, there's always context and nuance that comes in. I'd like to sort of finish up this sort of discussion, tying it a little bit more closely to the Basin Plan, and the Water Act reviews that are currently taking place. Before I actually do that, though, I am sort of seeing a few questions come in the Q&A, which is great. We'll try to get to those shortly. And if you do have other questions, please don't hesitate to put them in that Q&A, and we'll keep monitoring them and try to have a bit of time at the end. But firstly, to Yvette, what would recognition of water banking look like at this high policy level? Whether it's in the Basin Plan or the Water Act or in some other kind of national framework for water.
I think Simone's response there really highlights some of the complexity of the question. So when I've thought about this, I've assumed at the basin scale we might have an operator like the Murray-Darling Basin Authority involved, but that there are significant questions around governance and how would this work? And obviously state law is the key source of regulation of storage and recharge rights at the moment. I think it's a little bit questionable how the Basin Plan, Water Act, national framework sort of come in here to regulate this space. But to me, I think they have a couple of key roles. The first is that they have a role in promoting coordination and the hooks that can drive state action and incentives to improve their legislative frameworks. And if Australia was to go down the pathway of a basin scale water banking arrangement, probably the Murray-Darling Basin Agreement, potentially Basin Plan, would be the key instruments that might need to be changed to facilitate the arrangements to allow for that. I think the closest thing we have currently to like a water banking right in the basin is South Australia's deferral right or carryover right, which is the opportunity for South Australia to occupy like a share of the surface water upstream dams. And what we'd be potentially looking for here is recognition of groundwater capacity as also like a form of underground dam that could be used to store bulk water in the river system. And we'd need the agreement and frameworks in place to allow that water to be deferred in those banks, for losses to be attributed around that or lost savings to be credited. for water sharing between the states for their shares of water, including the state, the banked volumes, and rules for accounting ins and outs. I think we have very sophisticated water trade and accounting systems now that could be leveraged to support that. And any scheme or arrangement would also need to support co-investment by states in infrastructure around that. The role of the basin plan, I think, is a little less critical for this, but potentially it could be clearer in terms of it enabling or not limiting integrated or conjunctive surface water, groundwater management, such as through the SDO unit mechanisms, and could potentially have strengthened requirements in the water resource planning space around enabling the settings for water banking and the right incentives for efficient storage that we were talking about before. I think where we're at now with the basin plan review and the report or outcomes of that, there's a real opportunity. Would love to see water banking named as a credible underutilized basin tool that it could highlight the potential for it to meet some of the reviews calling for more integrated solutions that support climate adaptation and meaningful First Nations participation and improve our drought preparedness. I think it could point to the Water Act review as a key opportunity to investigate the basin scale enabling settings that I sort of talked about before under the Murray-Darling Basin Agreement. I think it could also call for consideration of groundwater options like water banking to be considered in replacing and upgrading aged infrastructure that it points to as well, and for further investigation to be done around the loss-saving potential of using water banking as opposed to large major storages. So those are a couple of ideas. I think just in terms of the National Water Agreement, which is that there is actually a groundwater subcommittee that is linked with the agreement too, and a national groundwater strategy. I think that policy framework is a key place for greater hooks to be put in place for states to act in this space and to continue to collaborate. And some sort of briefly, 3 key things I think could be done there is creating the momentum for states to take those small practical steps around streamlining approvals for MAR and water banking, and finding policy solutions that stop stop that barrier to investment and may not be as far as legislative change, but are at least a step in the right direction. I think they could also, the agreement could clarify the types of rights I've mentioned around, having the right to inject and the right to store and recover that water, and also provide some accountability for states to make sure that there's progress there and clear commitments around that progress.
Thanks for that. We've heard a lot about the accounting dimensions, the need for incentives, governance, and so forth. Andrew, could you maybe talk us through a little bit more some of the practical mechanisms and enablers needed in water banking?
Yeah, sure, Seth. I think that Yvette has now introduced a lot of the ideas, and also Simone's also talked about the South Australian example. So I'm going to concentrate a little bit now on just a couple of examples of what could be done under the basin plan and the review that's going on, which illustrates some of the points that Yvette was making. And the first one I wanted to talk about was how water banking could be used, I guess, to smooth or enable changes in the groundwater sustainable development limits, which have to be investigated now because they've been identified as under stress. So the upper and lower Namoy and Guaida regions in particular. So I think water banking can be developed in conjunction with changes in those SDLs and with discussion with communities and other stakeholders. So you develop the rules for the SDLs and the management of the aquifer management, the aquifer management plans, the rules in the aquifer management plans get developed with the idea about you could do water banking here, and that could create some opportunities for maybe a bit less reduction in the groundwater pumping at certain points, or more efficient use of the water that we've got. And it's not just in the those particularly stressed areas that have been identified. The plan review paper also talks about lots of other areas, mainly the alluvial aquifers through New South Wales, where there are localized risks and groundwater drawdown hotspots. And those are other areas where we could really look at opportunities for water banking to manage those issues. And looking at the planning rules that Yvette raised, I think there's an opportunity perhaps to look again at the water planning rules. For example, there are some provisions there for taking measures to prevent declines in groundwater levels, and this is adaptive management measures. And I think we could try to get water banking and MAS explicitly recognized among those measures. That would also improve the rollout. And the second kind of example that I wanted to talk about was the proposals for improving Northern Basin river connectivity, which are included in the discussion paper. At the moment, it's proposed that there be some, it's not just, it's a very good proposals for improving environmental flows along the Barwon-Darling River. But it's concentrated at the moment only on the surface water aspects, and it doesn't integrate the surface water, groundwater interactions and floodplain harvesting. And the way they're explaining that is that it's, there are a lot of questions still around about these interactions. Now, my argument would be that we already have lots of research that's come in that's shown groundwater extraction reduces river-based flows, while surface water extraction and floodplain harvesting reduce groundwater recharge along the Barwon-Darling. And climate change is just compounding those pressures. So I think that the Northern Basin Connectivity Programme is likely to be much more effective, even in the short term, if it could be integrated with these groundwater surface water connections. And this is where water banking might really play a role in alleviating some of the impacts on stream flow. So I think that's the second and the last example. I just wanted to come back to storage. Well, I've already talked quite a lot about storage opportunities, but under the water infrastructure component of the basin review, then that's a place where we could really bring in much more consideration of the groundwater storage opportunities.
Thanks, Andrew. That's great. We're getting a little bit short of time, so we might just jump straight into a couple of questions. And the first one is from Tim Phillips, and I might direct that to you, Simone. So the question is, that we've heard a lot about the MAR implementation in South Australia. What have we learned that could be applied more broadly for the Murray-Darling Basin? Are there any sort of key lessons learned that are worth sharing?
Yes, obviously lots, but setting up enabling frameworks. So it's one thing to know technically that you can do MAR in a particular aquifer in a particular location, and that is a huge part of enabling a MAR scheme to go ahead. But having the policy frameworks that actually enable that water to be accounted for under the legislation and be issued a water right is the really important part that makes it something really feasible for people to want to embrace and take on, because when they do have that security of a water right, they're more likely to invest in, these schemes aren't cheap to put into place. It costs a lot of money to put the bores in to inject the water, to put the bores in to recover the water if you're not using the same bore for that purpose. But you're not going to invest that money if you don't have a policy framework that enables you to move forward with your project and have that security moving forward of knowing how much water you're going to be able to recover, under what circumstances and where. So I think that's probably the key learning, is that you've got to get the policy right. Even if all the technical stuff's right, if the policy doesn't work, it's not going to be taken up.
Thank you. The next question I'll pick is from Pippa Williams. Talking about the 4,000 gigalitres that was mentioned earlier in this presentation. How developed are these opportunities, and what percentage of this do you think would actually stand up to further investigation? I might ask Andrew if you'd be happy to have a go at that one. So it's really about, I guess, what percentage of that large storage area do you think could actually be viable? Do you have any kind of sense of that? Do we even know?
These are estimates which it's the feasible water banking area. So it's mainly identified areas that are close both to river stems and also storage aquifers, and also have got good demand possibilities. And, it's one thing to identify what may be feasible. It's another question altogether to transform all these feasible opportunities into real projects, right? And so we've had a lot of discussion already today about, all of the complexities involved for the proponents, some of the legal, the regulatory challenges, the transaction costs in doing this. And then sometimes just the entitlement structures are not there at the moment. So, Seth, in short, there's lots of opportunity, but there are a few challenges to break down. And in some places it'll go. In some places the case will be so compelling that projects will go ahead, either sponsored by town water or by irrigation. Also in some cases maybe helped a bit by government. I think it's a very rich field of opportunity.
Thank you, Andrew. And look, I think we're getting very close to time. I was hoping to spend a little bit more time on the Q&A, but I think we are sort of a minute before the hour, so we might wrap it up. And I'd like to first really thank sincerely our panelists, Simone, Andy, and Yvette, for joining us today and really providing some fascinating insights on the question of water banking and what it means to the basin plan, or the basin plan review, I should say. I would briefly like to promote, I guess, what comes next, the next of our webinars, and this is on tomorrow, same time as the one today. Different topic. The topic is addressing water quality threats, and they'll be chaired by Professor Mike Stewardson. So thanks everyone for your time today. Really enjoyed this discussion, and looking forward to the next session tomorrow.